Along the lower reaches of the Rhine railway line, Friedrich had learned from the age of 12 to use the second hand of a clock to judge whether the world was normal, whether trains arrived on time, whether freight was checked into the warehouse at the scheduled hour, whether the light in the dispatch office came on exactly on the hour. These everyday details formed the entirety of his faith in how things should be. His father was a technician with the German National Railway. Every day he carried a metal pen polished to a shine, drawing perfectly straight lines across maintenance logs. He liked to say that the order of a nation was hidden in those lines. Before the war, the German railway system was renowned for its precision. As long as the trains ran on time, it seemed that everything was under control. Friedrich's childhood was measured out by this rhythm. Breakfast at 6:30, the fixed pattern of steam whistles on his way to school. His mother in the evening stacking the next day's tickets and the household ledger into a neat pile. He believed the world would run according to rules, and as long as he submitted himself to those rules, he could preserve a small patch of stability outside whatever chaos might come. When the war began, that order first cracked slightly, then tore away in great slabs. More and more trains disappeared from the timetable as fuel allocations were cut. Dispatch room reports began to show erasures and corrections, diverging from what actually happened on the tracks. The air raid siren sounded more often than the locomotive whistle. Blackout regulations plunged the streets into a stage set stripped of light and sound. For the first time, Friedrich realized that the rules his life depended on were coming apart. At 18, he received his call-up papers. His mother tried to hold herself steady, folding his clothes as neatly as if he were going away for an internship. But by the time she reached the last shirt, her hands were visibly shaking. His father packed the bag for him, movements mechanical, saying hardly a word. At the end, he handed over that polished metal pen. For a man of the railway, it summed up a lifetime. Precision, coolness, rules that did not change. Friedrich took it, knowing that the order which had sustained their household could no longer protect him. Military training was much more chaotic than he had imagined. Instructors' commands often failed to match the distribution of supplies. Weapons were short of parts or badly maintained. Training plans were rewritten again and again. Men came and went through the company, and no one could explain why someone was suddenly transferred away. The immaculate ranks and efficient command that appeared in propaganda posters might as well have existed behind glass. He still forced himself to get up on time, to pack his kit properly, to count and recount his belongings, but the more he clung to routine, the more he could feel the structures around him sinking. In March 1945, the Americans launched their decisive offensive along the Rhine. Artillery roared without pause, as if tearing open the air itself. German positions were stripped away like scenery in a gale. The company's communication network collapsed completely by midday on the first day. Orders from higher up swung back and forth between hold the line and withdraw, pulling units in opposite directions. The roads filled with retreating vehicles, abandoned equipment, and soldiers on foot. No one really knew where they were going next. In this landscape of blackened soil and shattered trees, Friedrich saw for the first time a jarring contrast. The American advance was not the chaotic and brutal spectacle that leaflets had promised, but the calm operation of a vast machine. Tanks moved along routes that looked as if they had been planned long in advance. Supply trucks threaded through in fixed intervals. Infantry columns kept an even pace. Standing in burned-over ground, he watched the enemy's order roll forward, as though another world were swallowing his own. By the second evening, their position had been completely overrun. He and the remnants of his company fled through a strip of woodland, beneath a sky pressed low by smoke. When they emerged from a stretch of marsh, bright headlights snapped on in front of them. American military police. The shouted commands were clear and steady. They were told to lay down their weapons and raise their hands. Friedrich's first sensation was not fear, but a strange loosening, as if some inner brace had suddenly been removed. For this moment at least, he no longer had to maintain a facade of order for a structure that was already collapsing. The processing of prisoners moved too quickly for anyone to absorb. Their names were entered on short forms. Numbers were written on wooden tags and hung around their necks. They moved in single file into a temporary holding area. There were no jeers, no staged brutality, only repeated instructions, the same marching pace, a fixed rhythm of sorting and moving. At night they were issued thin blankets and a hot meal. The portions were small, but the food was cleaner than anything his unit had eaten in the last months on the Rhine front. In transit, they were taken to a collection point on a Belgian riverbank, then to a port for embarkation. At each handover, a different American unit took charge, yet the steps were almost identical: registration, inspection, issue of rations, counting, recounting. For the first time, Friedrich understood something. The enemy state did not need attitude to prove anything. Its procedures alone were enough to impose themselves. The transport ship to America was hot and airless. The holds were crowded. Alarms sounded often, and the hull heaved in heavy seas. Even so, food came at fixed times. Medics checked water supplies and ventilation. No one tried to explain some larger moral principle to them. No one offered comfort. Everything simply followed the diagrams in some unseen manual. Holding his father's metal pen in his hand, Friedrich felt as though he had been taken over by a system larger and more stable than the one that had shaped him. It did not feel like safety or trust, only a profound sense of the unknown. If the enemy's machinery was more stable than his own country's, what exactly had he been fighting for? The ship lurched through cross seas like a building shaken by far-off thunder, but the routine never broke. For the first time, he sensed that the world to which he had tried to anchor himself might no longer exist. Sea air on the American coast was drier than in Europe. When the hatch doors opened and light flooded the ship's interior, Friedrich saw trucks lined up neatly on the quay, military police standing at fixed intervals, prisoner columns moving by number. The whole scene resembled an immense net in which disorder was automatically filtered out. They were loaded onto trucks and driven inland. The roads were wide, signs clearly marked, filling stations and depots laid out as if by ruler along the route. Compared with the bomb-scarred landscape of the Rhine, the countryside here imposed a different kind of pressure. This was a country that seemed never to have been physically touched by war. At the POW camp, the sun was setting behind the barbed wire perimeter, barrack roofs casting long shadows on the ground. The checkpoint resembled an administrative office more than a prison gate. The prisoners were ordered into single file and passed one by one through identity checks. Each step was timed to the minute, not early, not late. In the shower block, hot water ran reliably. Soap was issued at a standard weight. An army doctor used a steel pen to enter Friedrich's height, temperature, pulse, and upper arm circumference on a chart. Deft movements, free of emotion, free of comment. The quartermaster who handed out camp clothing did not exchange greetings with the POWs, only checked names against a list and passed over identical garments. Every process meshed like cogs in a geared mechanism. In the weeks that followed, he was taken in by this system layer by layer. Fixed mealtimes, fixed work details, fixed roll calls, fixed medical checks. The food on his tray, though far from generous, was more regular, and in many ways more nourishing than anything he had eaten in the last half year in uniform. He did not dare dwell on this, and would not admit it. He simply ate as the others did. One morning the trucks took them out past the wire onto a straight country road, deeper into the interior. Early spring air carried a dry smell of soil. The fields along the roadside were marked off in neat rectangles, their boundaries like lines on a map. Friedrich could not help but compare this to the Rhine banks, where fortifications and bomb craters had torn the land into ragged scraps. He found he had no vocabulary for this difference. The scale of the corn farm they arrived at lay beyond his previous experience. At home, German fields belonged to families, handed from father to son, with ploughing and harvest dependent on human hands and animals. Here the farm looked more like a simplified factory. Tractors moved along fixed tracks. Seeders dropped kernels with mechanical regularity. Irrigation pipes ran buried beneath the soil. Everything seemed cool, stable, and uninterested in slogans. The farmer said nothing to welcome or threaten the POWs. He simply checked the head count on the crew boss's sheet and told them to collect their tools in order. The work was not a brutal scramble, but a rationed expenditure of physical effort. Weeding in the mornings, checking irrigation in the afternoons, sometimes loading in the storage sheds. Each task had its slot on the crew boss's clipboard, with clear time blocks beside it. Falling behind did not bring a beating, only a mark in the margin. Finishing early did not bring reward, only reassignment. For the first time, Friedrich encountered a world that did not care who he was, or what he believed, or what uniform he had worn. He was just a unit in a system designed to use units. One of the civilian farmhands cast a glance at him in passing one midday. It was not hostile, but complicated in a way he could not pass. Another day, during a short break at the water barrel, the man muttered something under his breath that might have been a complaint or a simple observation. "You lot get your rations more regularly than we do." There was no insult in his tone, no flare of emotion. It was merely a fact. The sentence lodged in Friedrich's mind like a stone in the tread of a boot. He pushed it aside, as he had learned to ignore irritants, but the crack it opened did not heal. Days were now segmented with precision. Trucks arrived and departed at the same times. The farm's workload held steady. Camp roll calls came like the strike of a clock. At night, the lights went off at a fixed hour. He could hear the record boards being moved in the corridor, a soft sliding of cardboard and wood. The system dictated when to sleep, when to wake, when to work, without needing anyone's belief to sustain it. This stability was not warmth. It was as cool and unyielding as metal. At the end of April, rain came earlier than usual. Standing in front of the barn, the farmer checked weather notes and soil charts, then told the crew boss to rearrange the week's tasks. There was no complaint, no lament about the season, just the insertion of environmental data into an existing structure. Watching him fold up the sheet, Friedrich realized that here rainfall mattered more than war. Storm fronts carried more weight than front lines. In a place where war could be treated as background noise, the words of propaganda seemed to lose their grasp. He began exchanging his work chits at the camp canteen for paper, and at night he would jot down the sequence of tasks in a day, sometimes trying to imitate the farmer's way of ordering work. It was not study in any formal sense. It was impulse. An attempt to grasp the shape of the structure kept this world running. On a routine medical morning, the air was still cool, the day not yet warmed. Light in the camp infirmary was steady. The outside wind was shut out by plaster walls, and the loudest sound inside was the soft rasp of pages being turned. POWs stepped up in numerical order, took off their shirts, had their temperature, pulse, and upper arm girth measured. The medical officer's movements bore the imprint of thousands of repetitions, no wasted beats. When Friedrich stepped onto the scale, the officer nudged the weight along the bar. The faint clink of metal felt like a verdict. Friedrich waited for the pen to scratch on paper, his eyes drifting over the row of figures already recorded for him over previous months. From 58 kilograms, 63, 66. The numbers rose with an almost uncanny smoothness, as if some invisible force were being poured steadily into his body. There was no exaggeration there, no rhetoric. The sequence of digits was reality itself. Since becoming a prisoner, he had become healthier. The officer wrote down that day's weight, tapped the paper once with his pen as if to check the ink, and moved on. He did not look up. There was no congratulations, no hint of irony, only the workings of the machine. Then the sheet went into a file box with a practiced motion. For an instant, as he stepped down from the scale, it struck Friedrich. He was not being treated well. He was being kept at a useful operating level. He was a resource, not a subject. Leaving the infirmary, sunlight seemed harsher than usual. Walking along the camp's main lane, his step faltered, not from physical weakness, but because something in his inner framework had been kicked away. His homeland was falling apart, and the enemy was maintaining him. That same afternoon, a letter came from the lower Rhine. The paper was so thin, it was nearly translucent. The postmark blurred by its long journey. His mother's handwriting was still neat, but the strokes betrayed fatigue. She wrote that food rations in town had been cut yet again. that the railway factory had closed several workshops after bombing, that the queue for staples in the town centre grew longer every week, that potatoes spoiled by an early frost would be hard to replace. She tried to reassure him, "We are all fine." But the ink at the end of that sentence was noticeably heavier, as if the pen had lingered. Then he saw the line, "We have not had a letter from your brother for 3 months." The pressure of the pen bit visibly into the paper. That was the reality he least wanted to face. He was putting on weight in enemy hands, while those at home were surviving on less and less. The two facts lay beside each other in the afternoon light, blocking his breath. At dusk, the trucks once more took them out to the farm. After rain, the soil was dark and moist with the smell of newly turned earth. The crew boss assigned them to the cornmeal storehouse first, to shift bags and update inventory, then to check the irrigation lines. In the barn, record sheets hung from nails. Loading lists were clipped onto iron hooks. Every figure lined up in its column, dates forming unbroken sequences. Friedrich reached out and touched one of the sheets. The chill of the paper made the skin on his back tighten. Outside, the crew boss and the farmer stood discussing adjustments to watering intervals. The farmer consulted thermometer readings and rainfall notes. He spoke in a tone entirely unrelated to politics or the front. His day revolved around yield. He had no reason to notice the POW listening behind him, and no need to. His life could proceed without reference to wars and borders, but not without crop reports. As the men were leaving the barn, the civilian labourer from town passed by. Glancing over, he tossed out a line in a voice so low the breeze almost took it. "Prisoners get their meals more regularly than we do." That was the blow that tore open the crack in Friedrich's mind. His breath stalled, not from shame, not from fear, but from the realization that the system in this country was powerful enough to provide more stable living conditions for captured enemies than for some of its own workers. Germany, he thought, had not only lost a war, it had lost a way of organizing the world. He had always believed German order surpasses American order. Now, facts unfolded in front of him with an impersonal clarity. American order needed no propaganda. Its simple functioning made itself felt. That night in the barracks, he sat on his bunk, listening to the sound of account books being closed in the corridor before lights out. It was as if the enemy were recording his existence with the same steady strokes with which his father had once logged locomotives. Looking down, he saw the lines of muscle on his forearm were more defined than a year ago. His skin had lost its waxy pallor. The camp at night lay as heavy and muffled as air under deep soil. Only the unseen generator somewhere in the compound droned softly. Lying on his pallet, Friedrich ran his fingertips along the grain of the boards. He knew every ridge and knot by now, but tonight the wood felt different, rougher, more real, as if some new tactile layer had emerged. He could not yet assemble his thoughts. The day's fragments, the doctor's pen hovering over the chart, the thinness of the letter from home, the aligned figures in the barn, the gleam of the metal sprinkler heads, the worker's offhand sentence, spread out in his mind as if laid on a single seamless sheet. He had grown up believing that order was a culture, a German trait embodied in his father's metal pen, his mother's ledger, the tidy habits of their household. On American soil, he saw something else. Order here did not seem to derive from culture. It functioned like a structure that sustained itself without requiring belief. It could absorb prisoners, absorb the war itself, absorb complaints and labor. It did not need to be revered. It needed only to be carried out. He suddenly recalled what the front had looked like on the Rhine in early 1945. Officers stripped of bearings, radio operators running with dead sets in their arms, withdrawal routes jammed into chaos. Decisions taken under pressure of panic and rumor, anxiety hanging like dust over the whole sector. Above that same landscape, American supply columns had rolled along parallel roads, wheels turning in unbroken lines. The result had been decided there and then. He simply had lacked the language to grasp it. Lights went out on the minute. Darkness dropped into the barracks as if a switch had flipped. a quiet but absolute act. Breathing around him settled into an even pattern. No one talked. No one tossed and turned. The system had already decided for them when and how they should rest, at what tempo they would wake. It was this stability that aroused in him a deep fear, not of the enemy, but of discovering that the order he had trusted all his life had been only the shadow of a larger one. He rolled onto his side and looked toward the window. Far off, there was a faint glow above the barns. That light did not burn for prisoners. It burned for grain, for pumps and machinery. The world out there continued on its own terms, untroubled by decrees or proclamations. In that moment, he grasped the reverse side of something his father had once said. That order was not something people imposed. It was something they had to submit to. War had not destroyed him. It had carried him to a vantage point from which he could see a stronger structure. In the following days, his movements took on a strange detachment. He weeded, carried sacks, checked irrigation lines as usual, but every action felt like both work and observation. He was no longer simply performing tasks. He was probing the way this system moved. At midday, he sat in the shade with his precisely portioned meal in his mess tin. He could now see the ration chart behind it. Calories calculated not to be generous, not to be kind, but to keep labor power in a preferred range. Back in his unit on the Rhine, rations had lurched with the front's fortunes, handed out according to arbitrary decisions and moods. Here, food came from an algorithm of logistics and policy, not from attitudes. That afternoon, assigned with 2 others to check main irrigation pipes for blockages, he turned over soil and noted the numbered joints, the orderly string of junctions. Even if he and the others vanished, the layout would remain. Someone else could slot into their place, and if no one did, the system would still adjust around the gap. It was not people that were irreplaceable here. It was the framework. That realization did not sting like an insult. It carried something heavier than humiliation. At dusk, back in camp, he noticed the chart outside the infirmary. It listed the day's weight readings for all POWs by number, neatly aligned, without comment. Numbers alone. But they held power by the very fact of being recorded. Next to his code, he read 66.4 kilograms. In Germany, rail records had once guaranteed the operation of the nation. Here, someone's ledger was guaranteeing his physical condition. He could neither deny this nor explain it away. Night fell. Wind brushed the wire and made the strands hum faintly, a thin, metallic rhythm. To his own surprise, he realized he could no longer bring himself to hate that rhythm. It possessed qualities he had thought of as purely German. Stability, constancy, a lack of need for fanfare. That, more than guns, could change a man. The turning did not come in a single moment. It accumulated over ordinary days. When the last shocks had passed, what remained was not confusion, but a new, iron clarity. He could no longer understand himself solely as a prisoner, nor see America only through the eyes of a soldier. He had drifted into a space in between, at once part of the system and an observer of it. At night, after lights out, he would pull from under his bunk the stack of paper he had been filling and spread the sheets on the mattress. Fold lines showed where they had been handled dozens of times. Each sheet traced some logic he was trying to grasp. The cycle of irrigation, the layout of storage sheds, tractor routes and fuel consumption, the interplay of weather records and yields, the pattern in which workers were rotated across the fields. There was no overt politics in these diagrams, no emotion. They were not even knowledge in the scholarly sense, but a method, a way of making the world predictable. He knew he could not take the papers themselves with him. Outside this structure, they would lose meaning. They were tied to pumps and pipes and timetables, to roads and grain elevators and markets. None of that existed back home. He refolded the pages and put them away in a small wooden box, laying his father's metal pen on top. The dull gleam of the pen in the dim light sent a tight ache through his chest. The order his father had taught him was the very thing he now had to set aside. When the trucks were late by 10 minutes one morning because of a minor mechanical fault, the POWs waited without complaint. The crew boss came out and said matter-of-factly, The truck will come. The line was simple, but to Friedrich it carried a familiar weight. In a functioning world, delays were just that. Delays, not collapse. He understood that once he went back, he was unlikely to find this kind of simplicity again. He began noting the farm routines in finer detail: soil moisture, weather shifts, the arc of the sprinklers, the pattern of storage usage, not because he believed he would rebuild such a system at home, but because for the first time he knew that order could be understood instead of merely obeyed. In the warehouse one day he happened upon the farm's annual planning ledger. It was a thick book. The first pages charted projected rainfall and yields for the year. The rest broke down monthly work allotments, maintenance schedules for equipment, planned grain reserves, expected losses and profits. Standing under the dim light, thumbing through the carefully written numbers, he felt something heavy settle around him. This was a world outside the war. A world that, even amid conflict, had to plan for the next year. He thought of his father's letters about railway shutdowns, factories pushed beyond design limits, ration cards shrinking. German planning had been tied to the war's demands, continually reshaped by it. Here, the war sat on top of a system that had its own long-term logic. The difference between those two structures was more decisive than any weapon. He did not become fond of America. He did not feel grateful. He simply acknowledged that the order he had known had been briefly stable but could not endure, while this other order retained its everyday logic within war. The difference ran deeper than kindness. It had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with structure. On some nights he tried to imagine the Rhine campaign if his own country had possessed a comparable cool system, one not fueled by speeches and exhortations, but by procedures and planning. Would that collapse have been avoided? He had no answer. The question itself was enough to shift something in him. When the repatriation list went up, the sky was muted and still. Morning fog lay thin on the fields. Names and numbers were posted on a wooden board, the paper itself stirring faintly in the breeze. His prison number sat in the upper half of the second page, the letters as neat and impersonal as any entry in an inventory. He did not know what he was supposed to feel. The list's calm was more real than any formal order. His usefulness here had run its course. In the last week before departure, the trucks continued to carry them to the farm. The farmer, as always, tapped the day's yield figures with a fingertip and sent them to check the pipes. He said nothing about the end of the war, nothing about the prisoner's return. In his world, seasons outweighed history. Standing on the bund between rows of corn, watching the sprinklers sweep their arcs under the control of automatic timers, Friedrich understood. Whether he stayed or left, someone else would simply step into his slot, or no one would, and the system would adjust. It did not lean on any single human being to keep its balance. Behind that stability he felt a tremendous unspoken force. Not willpower, not enthusiasm, but structure. He lingered on the bund until the crew boss called them back to work. On his final night, he laid all his sheets of paper on the bunk. Fold lines and rubbed erasures showed how often he had handled them. Each page set out some pattern, the recurrence of tasks, the mapping of space, the relation between inputs and outputs. There was nothing of ideology in them, only lines and arrows. He refolded them slowly, placed them at the bottom of the box, and set the metal pen on top. In the yellowing light, the pen's reflection was faint. The order of his father's world would not carry him any further. At dawn, they formed up in the camp square. Trucks idled beyond the wire, dew beading on their tires. With a small bundle over his shoulder, Friedrich moved with the column toward the gate. Passing through, he glanced one last time toward the cornfields. The sprinklers had just come on, water arching along its regular path, unaltered by his departure. The sight left him slightly dizzy, as if the ground had shifted. This place did not need him, yet it was here, in enemy hands, that he had first understood how the world might function. The truck engine rumbled into life, the vibration climbing from his feet into his chest. He gripped the wooden sideboard, not in fear, but with a deep reluctance, not for the country itself, but for the structure he would be leaving. He understood now that being fattened in captivity had not been a matter of nutrition. His body had been maintained by a pattern. His thoughts had been rearranged by it. As they drove out, the road unfurled between fields that stretched to the horizon. Somewhere at the far end lay the ruins of his homeland. The rhythm of this land would not follow him there. Back in Europe, the air was colder, thick with damp. Around the port lay stacks of weathered crates, abandoned rails, loading frames warped by rain. Prisoners were sorted by region and loaded into different convoys. The road inland took them past towns whose outlines he recognized: broken rooftops, unrepaired bridges, locomotives idle on sidings lacking parts and maintenance. Grass had grown tall along the rails. The metal had lost its shine. On village streets, people queued outside makeshift ration points, clutching cards and jars. The line moved slowly. The air held a different kind of tension, not the sharp fear of war, but the heavy fatigue of disorder. From one house came the crying of a baby, thin and continuous. No one on the street seemed to react. His mother lived on the edge of town. When she saw him, her expression was layered: relief, uncertainty, something like guilt. The room smelled of damp. It was a scent he now recognized as part of the war's aftermath. Pouring him water, she used a glass whose rim bore a hairline crack. Her hands were noticeably thinner, veins standing out under the skin. He tried to describe the camp, the procedures, the farm, the charts. But whenever he reached for those structures in words, his speech halted. He realized that the framework he had seen could not simply be transplanted into this room. The order here had been hollowed out. The scaffolding of institutions remained, but the force to sustain them was gone. That night, he laid out his last scrap of camp paper and a handful of worn work chits, attempting to reconstruct on the kitchen table the cycles and flows he had drawn back in America. When he reached the arrows for irrigation intervals, the pen stopped. Those cycles depended on machines, fuel, roads, supply chains, markets. None of these existed in this space. The blank corner of the page shone under the candle like a bare patch of sky. He put the pen down. He could not use that logic to rebuild this world, nor could he make this world answer to that logic. He understood then what the real cost of the war had been. Not only the razed cities, but a country that had lost the ability to run itself. The candle flame trembled. The half-drawn chart curled slightly. Outside, wind passed over rusting tracks and made the iron sing faintly, a strained, uncertain sound that bore no resemblance to the measured pulse of the sprinklers far away across the Atlantic. He did not know how he was supposed to live in such a place. He only knew that the one thing he had brought back from captivity was not his weight, nor even his memories, but a way of measuring. He had seen that the world could be stable in a very particular way, and the place where he now stood was not like that. Leaning back in his chair, he stared at the empty paper as the night deepened. When the candle finally burned out, the room sank into darkness. From far off came the grinding start of a locomotive, uncertain on damaged rails. Once, that sound had meant order. Now, on this track, it sounded labored and indistinct. In the dark, he understood that he could never fully return to the world he had known before.